been fighting to protect their lake and their livelihood for decades now. And I remember when I went fishing with Uncle Frank at Pyramid, we were just fishing and it was just another lake. I had no idea about the environmental concerns. I didn't even know we were on an Indian reservation. It was just a lake to me. So I mentioned this because, first of all, I wanted to remind us all that we're on the lands of the Great Basin tribes of Nevada, which include the Washoe, the Northern Paiute, the Southern Paiute, and the Western Shoshone. But I also share this story because I think it should remind us as educators and researchers that it's part of our job to educate and inform the general public about Native communities and the issues they face. Because I suspect there's a lot of folks like I was that think of places like Pyramid as just another lake. And in fact, for the tribe there, the threats that they face are existential in their livelihood and their existence. So one of the ways we can raise the awareness about tribes and tribal issues is partnering with the 1994s, which is what I want to talk about now. So I want to talk about what the 1994s are, some basic information, because in any audience, there's probably some of us that are new to the 1994s. And then I want to talk about capacity issues, some ideas around building capacity, and then some thoughts around collaboration. So what are the 1994s? There's 35 of them across 16 states. 14 of those are in the Western region. They're mostly rural reservation-based institutions. If you ask me what's their core identity or what are they about, I would say first and foremost, they're student-focused. They provide open access to both Native and non-Native students. These are the kids, the students that would probably not go to college otherwise. They are place-based institutions. They're very focused on community and culture. And there's about 30,000 students all told, part-time, full-time across the system. Yeah, sure. No, the question was how many of the 35 tribal colleges actually offer ag programs or ag curriculum? Not many ag per se, probably a handful. I want to say maybe a dozen. Most of the programs are natural resource management, environmental science is a big area. And I would say almost all of them have programs in those areas. Thank you. Ask questions, thank you. Okay, so real quick about some things about the 1994s. I would say because we're student driven, we offer what's called high touch support. That's because most of these students are first generation college students, come from low income backgrounds, come through K through 12 systems that don't prepare them well for college. So, you know, they require and are provided more support. So our faculty ratios can be 5-to-1, sometimes even less than that, 4-to-1. I will say distance education is a growing area of opportunity. We pivoted back when COVID started, just like you all did, and that was rough. We had a lot of dropouts, we had a lot of failures, but the students have gotten on board with it, and in some cases, they don't want to go back to campus. You know, these students were driving an hour one way to get to classes, so it makes sense. So I think that's remote learning for us is here to stay. Faculty, the 1994s are primarily teaching institutions. That's how they got their start. So faculty are kind of treated like that in a sense. They're on annual 10-month contracts for the most part. There's no tenure track positions. Their typical course load is a 6-6 or more. I've talked to people that are teaching 8 courses a semester, every semester. There's no research appointments per se. If they're going to do research, it's an add-on, typically in the summers or after hours. And as you can see in this chart, most of them hold master's level degrees. In some, they're overworked, underpaid, with limited advancement opportunities, but yet they are very aspirational. We have surveys that show that this is heartfelt work that they're doing, and they're in it for the right reasons. Okay, extension. If you took the fiscal year 21 funding levels and you divide it up by 35 colleges, you'd come out with about $240,000 per institution if everybody competed successfully. So with 240K, if you were starting up an extension program, you might figure you're going to hire a director, maybe a little office space and some staff support, and have some program dollars to spend. But that's about it. So 1994 extensions have to pick their battle. They can focus on one or maybe two things, and that's about it. That's all the capacity they have. They can't do everything for everyone. So they may focus on youth development and household and community gardening, or maybe economic development with farmer and rancher business education or something like that. Within the context of communities that have deep needs across a wide range of areas. With regard to research, our research grant right now offers funding at the low end, $60,000 per project to up to $500,000 per project, research project. So 60,000 is what's called student-led research, and $500,000 would be a fully developed research project. These are 2 to 3 years in duration, and there is a partnership requirement. You're required to partner with 1862 and 1890, an ARS station or School of Forestry. So given that, these research projects tend to be very applied with immediate tangible benefits to the community, solving real immediate concerns and problems within the community. They try to incorporate indigenous knowledge with Western science, and they're going to give high priority to impacts in the community and less priority to publishing and writing successful grants, because since they're not tenure track, there's no incentive to publish. So if there's a tribal college in Pyramid Lake, for instance, you could probably bet they would be doing research on water quality or maybe fisheries work. Yes, sir.
When you mentioned that these instructors have such high teaching loads that research is is really an afterthought. So is there actually much going on?
Yeah, amazingly there is. There's only $4 million in that grant project, so not everybody's doing it. Typically, they can award about 10, 12 grants a year per grant cycle. So there is good research happening. They're sharing the load and they're making it work, but typically at the higher capacity tribal colleges. And I'll talk about what that looks like in a moment. And if you know your way around the CRIS reporting system, you can check it out in NIFA. Okay, so I want to talk about capacity issues or limitations. I'm going to break them out into what's, I think, externally driven and what's internally driven. So we'll start with external forces. So first of all, the 1994s are not very well known politically or otherwise. So what you have is out of sight, out of mind. So a lot of times they're not thought about when policy is developed or funding streams are created. The funding has been inadequate since forever. And here are our funding numbers. And I just updated the 22 numbers that were just enacted, last week. So you can see these are millions. So 8.5 million in 21 for extension, 9.5. So we got $1 million bump in 22. And then the 23 numbers, these have been supported by APLU. We're asking for $17.5 million in each of these program areas. We get that number. We said that if every one of the 35 institutions had $500,000 per program, then what we could do is hire 2-3 FTEs, have them travel to places like this and have program dollars. That to us seems like a fair, reasonable footprint foundation of base capacity. See, we were never properly funded. So think of yourself as a startup company. One of the main reasons that startups fail is they're undercapitalized. we were capitalized at essentially zero. I remember my first year was extension director at Cheyenne River in fiscal year 97. The first year we got funding, we got $50,000. I was out of my master's program. They paid me $30,000, which I thought was a lot of money back then. But with fringe and everything, that was it, you know? And I spent that whole year fundraising and writing grants just to try to get it going. And we were at that 50,000 level for quite a few years, and then it creeped up to 100,000. So we've never had a true baseline that we can work with, and I'm hoping that we can fix that this coming year. The perception is that 1994s are all the same, leading to cookie cutter approaches. So we see this often in federal programs that are rolled out, but also the other way this plays out is we have this thing called extreme users in design thinking, if you will. So if you have an experience with a really high capacity tribal college, the tendency is to extrapolate that to all of the tribal colleges. And so you have this great program and you make it available to all tribal colleges, and then you wonder why you didn't get enough applications. Or if you did have people apply, why they weren't as successful as the tribal college you know. And that's because you've taken one extreme user and extrapolated to all of the others. On the other hand, you might have an experience with a low capacity tribal college or 1994 and say, well, here's an opportunity, but they really can't handle it because they're too low capacity, when in fact, some of the higher capacity tribal colleges could take advantage of it. So that's why tribal colleges are very different across the spectrum. They come from different regions of the United States. They serve different ecosystems. They have different needs, and they have different capacities from very small to pretty robust. So avoid the cookie cutter approach. Little or no state support. And then finally, their collaborative relationships and networks are not well developed. And part of that is for the reasons I stated about just the lack of funding and the lack of capacity. Okay, so these next two slides are really the heart of my presentation. If I run out of time after this, I don't really care. We'll share these slides with you. So the internal issues around capacity, part of it is a leadership issue on the 1994's end. Because they're teaching institutions, the presidents tend to come from education backgrounds or maybe social work. I think only one or maybe two of the presidents has a land grant background. So they are first and foremost thinking about teaching. That's their core mission. That's their core, that's where they receive their core funding. And so sometimes that works to the detriment of land grant research and extension programs. Their institutional support is thin, just a very lack of a deep bench. So development office, finance office, post-award management, grants and management, a lot of these things the 1994 faculty does. So they may hunt for their own funding sources, they write their own grants, they do their own reporting, and sometimes they even manage their own accounts, your fiscal accounts. So that's another issue. The focus on local versus regional or national, because they're so community driven and focused, that tends to take up most of their time and attention. So we sociologists call that, they have low bridging social capital, which prevents access or limits access to outside information and resources coming in. And then because I mentioned the faculty don't have tenure. And then finally, you all know if you've done research, PhD students are the workhorses in your research factory. And if we don't have PhD students, we don't have PhD programs, then we don't have those workers to do the research. And then again, that falls on faculty to do the work, to collect the data, to do the field surveying, and with sometimes some undergraduate support. So this is the box we're in. I call this the capacity catch-22. We need money, we need funding to build institutional capacity, but yet we need institutional capacity to go find the money. And so we've been stuck in this box for a long time. The first one is easy in concept, hard in practice. We're trying to get more money. That, you know, we're working Congress, we're working through APLU, and if we can solve that, great. But let's say we're wildly successful and we get $100 million for the 1994s. We can't pour that money into these colleges because they don't, a lot of them don't have the institutional capacity to absorb those dollars and work with them. So we got to fix that lower one. We got to be able to build capacity without a lot of dollars available. So here are some ideas to do that. So I'm going to break them out into human capital and human capacity and program capacity. So visiting faculty and fellows from 1862s are federal agencies. So we had a soil scientist from the U.S. Forest Service teaching courses at a tribal college in Wisconsin. We can do more of that, and especially now remotely. You know, NIFA is hiring everybody remotely. So that opportunity, I think, is more open. Co-located offices and joint appointments. So in Wisconsin, the College of Menominee Nation, UW-Madison Extension has people co-located right on the tribal college campus. They're doing 4-H and youth development work. They're cross-pollinating. They're working together on grants and so forth. Doc students and postdocs at 1994s. At Sitting Bull College in North Dakota, we've had a couple of NDSU postdocs working there. In one case, they stayed on and are now permanent faculty. A lot of these postdocs are looking for teaching experience, and we should certainly have those opportunities at the 1994s. NIFA has been really receptive to considering supporting all of this, fellowships, internships, details, things like that. We're just trying to figure out how to make that work. Faculty to faculty sharing and mentoring. So think about in some of your departments, you do a really good job of mentoring junior faculty, new hires through the tenure track process, right? You protect them from too much service opportunities, you give them access to graduate students, you write them into grants, things like that. How about doing that for your 1994 colleagues so that you can help them progress in their careers and advance their programs? And then finally, share TA and training and professional development opportunities. You guys see those coming all the time in your emails. There's lots of, you know, trainings and so forth, academies and things like that. Share those with the 1994 folks that you work with and see if they'd be interested in those as well. Okay. And then in terms of program capacity, find the collaborative win-wins when you work together. And I mean collaborative, the win-win. A lot of times we end up compromising, which means I'm giving up a little, you're giving up a little to find a common area. And yet we call that collaboration. But if you have no capacity to give up, to compromise, then you're already, you know, struggling to make that. So we're looking for the win-win where nobody has to give up anything, but everybody gains from the endeavor. Leverage and share existing capacity to pursue more. So build on your strengths, go from good to great. Anything new that you are chasing means that it's going to cost you short-term capacity because you have that startup cost. No matter what you're doing, you're going to take a dip first before you start building momentum. And again, if you have no capacity, that initial startup cost might be too much to say yes to. Help build program staffing and infrastructure, build, don't drain. Whatever you do, write in something for faculty and staff and infrastructure support. In-kind support to help with the matching requirements. And then finally, and always avoid micro dollars for macro level efforts. Know when to say no, because we can't operate in the red. None of us can, you can't, we can't. Okay, so these are just real quickly some ideas of collaboration, some thoughts. With extension, we're all facing the same pressures to do more with less. A lot of the needs in rural communities are similar, whether they're native or not native. You've just, with native communities, you've got a cultural aspect or twist to it, but there's a lot of room to complement each other. and work together to leverage resources and make impacts in all of the communities that we serve in a lot of these areas. With regard to research, think about diverse pipelines of faculty and staff. I know all of you are interested in increasing diversity among your student body and your faculty body. And so if you engage with tribal colleges, you can extend that pipeline. They have a good pipeline from K-12 through their 2-year and 4-year institutions, but think about extending that into your 4-year programs and your graduate works. That can be a nice way to increase diversity and help the 1994s. And intermediary organizations like the ones I work for, the ones that you represent, can play a facilitating role in that, matchmaking, helping connect faculty to faculty around common interests and goals. Academic opportunities, the remote thing is really interesting to me. We're hearing from more and more of our academic deans that the students don't want to come back to campus, but that opens up a couple of areas for us. First of all, we have much greater access to faculty, teaching faculty now, if they can teach remotely. Before, we were limited to that small pool of qualified people inside the reservation boundaries or nearby areas, but now the sky's the limit. We can pull faculty from anywhere if needed. And likewise, students, we can reach out to students that might not have come to the tribal college because it was too far of a drive, or they had childcare needs or other family obligations, and now they can do a lot of this remotely. So I see this as a huge advantage for us, but also for you. We can share courses, we can share faculty, we can share students. The technology is there, and we just got to figure out how to make it work. Okay, and I got a couple of bonus slides here. I'll just throw in real quickly, and I'll take questions after that. This is a slide I shared at the CARET meeting a few weeks ago. They were talking about innovation, and I just want to throw out there that the 1994s can play a role in innovation. And somebody said, it's back to the future. We can look at indigenous ways, indigenous agricultural practices, varieties, food source varieties, ways of living sustainably, and see that as ways to approach a changing climate and a world where we're going to have to be more sustainable in our use of resources. Same thing with preserving and maintaining biodiversity. We have a lot of tribal lands that are managed that are sources of biodiversity that we can work to preserve and to protect. And then intergenerational knowledge transfer pathways, so connecting youth with elders and making sure that that indigenous knowledge, which a lot of it is oral, based knowledge, isn't lost over time, but transferred to our younger generation. We're going to be the ones that have to solve the mess that we're in. And then finally, I think there's an international opportunity here, connecting indigenous people across the world and connecting indigenous knowledge bases likewise. Last slide. These are just some do's and don'ts around collaboration. This was based on a state study from South Dakota. A while ago, they interviewed state collaborators, 1862 collaborators and 1994 collaborators, and they talked about what worked and what didn't. And you'd think it was obvious, but it still happens where people forget these basic rules of engagement. So yeah, with that, I'll stop and take a few questions if you have them. One question? Okay.
The time, oh, I'm sorry, Brett. I appreciate the time you put into this. I coordinate the Western SARE program, and we provide grant funding, and we'd certainly like to direct some towards the tribals more than desire. We want to do that. Would the sabbatical program that we currently have be a help in that regard, in which an individual can write, this isn't for somebody to travel to exotic lands, but it's to bring a teacher to a campus to teach.
Absolutely. If you're talking about maybe somebody at 1862 taking a sabbatical, and you bet. We've looked at, there's senior corps, AmeriCorps senior corps, where you get people late in retirement or moving into retirement, spending time at a tribal college. We've done an AmeriCorps Vista, but yeah, I think that would be, typically what you see is people late in their career taking the opportunity, and they can afford to take the risk of working at a tribal college. So not so much the junior faculty, which, understandably have to focus on getting their portfolio up and running. Great. Hey, thanks so much. I have their contact information. If you have any follow-up information or questions, I'll be happy to take them offline.
Thank you, John, for that presentation. Our next speaker is Maureen McCarthy, and the title of her presentation is Enhancing Native Agro-Ecosystem Resilience Through Expansion of Climate Services and Outreach. Maureen is the project director of the Native Waters on Arid Lands at the Desert Research Institution in Reno, Nevada. She's also the principal investigator for the new Native Climate Grant from USDA that involves many of our climate offices and our climate hubs around our region. Maureen.
And thank you all for this opportunity to talk to you. And thank you, John, for all of your comments. Chris, to address your question you just asked John, I asked them to bring up the Native Waters on Arid Lands website, nativewaters-aridlands.com. This has a suite of projects. And one of the things, if you look down in the lower right corner, it says NIFA tribal programs. If you go on to that, that was a project we did directly with NIFA last year, where we built out a collection of story maps, and that has all of the tribal research programs. So you can go on to that. You can click on any of those boxes. They're all collections of story maps, but there's about, and then it's got information about the tribal research programs. And so you can get an idea, and they're mapped, and it shows you what institution and who worked on them. So it's a good resource. We developed that in partnership with NIFA tribal programs last year. So if we can you back up to the, yeah. So I'm the project director for a collection of projects we've been working on for almost 10 years called Native Waters on Arid Lands, which was originally a CAP grant from NIFA in the Water for Agriculture program that went away in, I don't know, 2015, 2016, something like that. We got one of the last CAP grants. And we have subsequently spun off several projects. And the purpose of that suite of programs and projects is really focused on understanding the impacts of climate on water resiliency and tribal resiliency, tribal agricultural resiliency. So it's looking at the impacts of climate on water availability, accessibility, working with tribes throughout, predominantly, but not exclusively. We focused on what we call the Intermountain West. So that's the arid lands from the Northern Great Plains, Northern Rockies, down through the Great Basin and into the Southwest. We subsequently built out partnerships with tribes and tribal organizations throughout the rest of the country, but our heavy focus is really on those tribes that are suffering from impacts of changing water supplies. And we focused heavily on tribal agriculture, whether that's subsistence, food production, major agricultural production, or forestry in some cases, a lot of grazing, a lot of cattle, and some bison in these areas. So it's a large partnership. Stacy is one of the co-project directors from UNR. John is a co-project director from Falcon. So we had a partnership with all of the Falcon 94s, and we had several of them working directly on the main projects with us. In addition, we also partnered with the FERTEP program. And I like to refer to tribal extension as the core of understanding community needs and being able to build relationships with tribal communities. So tribal extension being both FERTEP and the 1994 extension. Could not have done this program without tribal extension, absolutely critical. And it is, in my perspective, I am non-native, like John. However, I do live on a tribal reservation. So when I'm not in Reno, which is some of the time, I am on the Flathead Reservation of the Salish and Kootenai. And that's because that reservation, even though it was set aside as tribal lands with the Treaty of Hellgate in 1855, was subsequently opened for white settlement in 1903. And the majority of the people in the farming communities there are non-native. So I do live there, so I do understand the water rights, and I do spend a lot of time working with Salish Kootenai College, which is about 5 minutes away from my small ranch. So native waters on arid lands really started focused on water, but we built out a series of projects from that. Of course, as everybody understood, when we hit COVID in 2020, Stacy called me and said, Maureen, there's a lot of problems going on right now. And this was early 2020, and we stood up a working group within about a week. We stood up a working group. We opened it up to all tribal extension throughout the country. We opened it up to tribal partners, farmers and ranchers. And then we brought our federal agency partners onto this. And that working group was meeting weekly up until last November. Now we meet monthly. Anybody here is welcome to join. Many of you have participated actively in this. But the purpose there was really to identify needs that were on the ground, partner with whatever federal agency may have the resources to make a difference in people's lives, because at this point, then we were dealing with concurrent emergencies of COVID and climate impacts. And they had, there was a lot of unfortunately, negative interactions between COVID and climate. Access to fresh water, a little hard to wash your hands 26 times a day when you don't have running water in your house, as was mentioned about Navajo and the shutdowns, the colleges and the reservations being shut down and people having lack of access to resources. And then of course we roll right into drought, wildfire season, heat waves last summer, while we're still dealing with COVID. So this was an opportunity for us to create a network of organizations where tribal communities could understand what was going on the ground, and we could reach out to USDA, to CDC when we needed specific information about facts, not fear. That was all about COVID. We reached out to FEMA, and FEMA's been very active in this and getting emergency resources to the tribes. And we understood that there were times when it was on beyond the federal government. So in December of 2020, we actually did an informal resource requests out to lots of different networks to send supplies up to our Alaskan Native groups outside of Bethel, who were cut off and dealing with no resources and no warm clothing for children to get through the winter because they couldn't get supplies in. So we've done a lot of different activities in these areas. Teaching Native Waters is another program that's focused on taking the climate, as John emphasized, place-based climate information and making it accessible to teachers, Native teachers, to be able to use in the classroom, or extension educators to use in informal education. So if you can transition to my slides. So we've recently, very recently, like the 1st of March, started a new project, which was just awarded by NIFA this year, and it's called Native Climate. And it's particularly relevant to this audience. Native Climate is a fully extension activity. It's a $1.5 million grant. It's focused on, in USDA's mind, it was focused on, the call was focused on making the climate hubs more relevant, not just to Native communities. This wasn't a Native research call, but it was a, the solicitation wanted to be able to make the climate hubs more useful and accessible across the United States, rural communities, urban communities, everything else. Our particular project is focused on strengthening the role of the climate hubs and all the other climate extension services across Indian country. Now, this is not, like I said, it's not research. This is an extension project. So our goal is to really be able to leverage the wealth of information. You heard about some of that. It could be water resources. It could be, issues pertaining to climate projections. It could be getting monitoring and on tribal lands. Be able to, so I can move. Can I move this? Yeah. So the purpose of this grant in our minds is really to strengthen the two-way communications. So that's to be able to understand the needs of the communities that we're serving. And those are, again, like I said, tribal reservations, predominantly, but not exclusively in the hub regions that are the Southwest region and the Northern Plains. So that covers a big chunk of what the Intermountain West area. Of course, it has the Great Basin, it has Northern Rockies, the Upper Missouri River Basin. But we're working with the network of hubs. So our goal is to be able to have this, whatever is produced to be accessible to anybody in the network. But we need to go two ways. We need to communicate climate services. And we, as a Western scientist, I tend to we produce things and we want to share them. We don't necessarily always do the listing. And when we started Native Waters on Arid Lands, and Stacy was organizing our first tribal summit, and I said to her, Stacy, what do I need to do at this summit? She said, sit down and listen. And that was the message for about 3 years. So we don't always hear the other side, but one of the things that I think, and John stressed this, that the tribal communities have been incredibly resilient, incredibly adaptive to climate change for thousands of years, long before we came around, right? Long before Western colonization occurred, tribal communities were adapting to large changes in climate. And as a result, there are a lot of traditional practices that are key for adaptation, and they're practices that we can certainly learn a lot about. So when I look at this project, the new project that we're doing, it's really to build that two-way communication and make sure we understand, yes, there's climate services that the tribes need, but there's also information that they have that can really benefit our understanding of what is adaptation and resiliency on the landscape. So how are we doing that in practice? So this is just, it's very high level. And like I said, we officially started the 1st of March. So we're still in the building stage, but we're building on a huge network, sets of networks of partnerships that we've had in existence. We created 3 Native Climate Fellow positions, and they are targeted at specific communities, and they're to be able to start that two-way communication. The first is the Native Climate Ag Fellow. That's the only one that currently exists. It's Vicki Head. Many of you may know Vicki. Vicki works with Stacy, and she is a member of the Cheyenne River tribe, and she lives up there. She is also a farmer and rancher, and she is our liaison out to the Native American Farmers and Ranchers Organizations, IAC. I came in, sorry, I was late this morning. My flight was late. I came back from SWIA, Southwest Indian Ag Conference in Phoenix yesterday. Also, and so her goal is to be able to network to those producer groups. One of the ones we're also working with Intertribal Buffalo Council, folks like that. We also have a Native Climate Data Fellow, and that person will be based at the University of Montana in the Montana Climate Office, focused explicitly on two things, one of which is expanding the monitoring of weather and climate data on reservations. If you look at maps, you will be horrified to see how little weather and climate monitoring is actually done on reservation lands. So we're working with several organizations to be able to get that done, get low-cost weather stations and monitoring. Also, big networks like the Mesonet expanded to be on reservations. So we are actually collecting data that gets fed to things like the drought monitor that determines who gets insurance payments in some cases. So we really need to increase that. But the other thing the Native Data Fellow will be doing is understanding data sovereignty and what are the requirements and the guidelines and the protocols for handling data that is collected on the reservations in accordance with the requirements of any given tribe. We will also have a Native Climate Teaching Fellow. That person will be managing our what we call communities of practice, which are Native teachers. And like I said, expanding the work we did in teaching Native waters to be able to really build out education modules, both for extension and also for formal education. Probably one of the most fun aspects of this grant is we realized that communication piece was missing. And so we created what's going to be called the Native Climate Reporters Program. These are going to be students who are in journalism. So 1862 folks out there, how many of you come from institutions with a school of journalism? Right, UNR, eh? Okay, we're going to be talking to you. How many of you have Native students in your journalism program? Do we? Yay! Okay, so unfortunately, there are no formal journalism programs in the 94 network. Is that correct? But we may still be tapping into the 94s, but predominantly we'll be going out to the 1862s and looking for students, Native students who are studying journalism, who can intern with us, and they'll be mentored by Kelsey Fitzgerald, who's been the communications director for Native Waters on Arid Land. And these are students who will be reporting on both climate impacts and climate resiliencies from their communities. And they will be taught all sorts of things like how to write a story and how to pitch a story to both Native media. And we have a whole bunch Kelsey has people clamoring to work with us from all the mainstream media networks, KUNR and several Indian media today, several of the big networks want to work with us to have students be introduced into getting their stories there. But they'll also be doing things like developing story maps and other communication tools to really get the message out from the ground out to the communities. And so it'll be a really fun part of the program. I look forward to working with many of the institutions who have journalism programs. So like I said, this is a rather complicated, non-traditional NIFA project in that it is all about partnerships. And one of the things that we've done in the partnerships is to create a advisory group. And each one of our advisors on that advisory group comes with a network that can help us, move climate services information in, also be able to reflect back resiliency and adaptation from the tribal communities. So WIDA is a member of the advisory group, and WASED Both. So you each will have a member on our advisory group, and Ed Martin. Yes, Martin, thank you. I keep wanting to say, I have another colleague at U of A called Ed Franklin, so I always get the names mixed up. Ed Martin, who's the acting extension director at University of Arizona, will be the WIDA rep, right? And so we've had a great connection with them. So this is an opportunity to have networks of networks, and each one of those positions on the advisory group will have a handful of folks who are native leaders in the area. John Phillips is on to represent the Falcon networks, and we'll be able to tap into your expertise, what you have available, but also be able to hopefully feed information back to you so that you become more aware of what the climate issues are, but probably even more, because everybody's been talking about climate impacts for years. More importantly, understanding traditional practices that enhance adaptation and resilience, whether that's water practices or agricultural practices or grazing practices or education, all of those things. So we look forward to working with you as this grant moves forward. Obviously, as I mentioned, tribal extension, we couldn't do anything really in Indian country without tribal extension and our native partners. I would love to see this room reflect more native participation as these groups, if I can be so bold as to say that in this meeting. And obviously we have researchers who have been working in Indian country on a lot of topics for a long time. They'll be engaged. The climate services that we'll be tapping into come not only from the hubs, but from the USGS CASCs, the NOAA RISA programs, and the Network of State Climatologists. Many of you probably know Steph McAfee, the Nevada state climatologist. And then we have, like I said, Native American advisors who will be helping us understand some really key things like handling geospatial data collected about reservations and how do we do that properly. Lots of different topics there. So stay tuned. You know, I tend to not like to talk about projects as they're just getting started, but this group is an integral part of this kickoff. So we look forward to working with you, and hopefully you'll be able to give me some feedback in the course of this meeting. The water issues are a major issue. And as like I said, I live on the Flathead Reservation of the Salish and Kootenai. That tribal settlement just came in. That water settlement was just enacted a year ago. Many people don't realize that part of that water settlement also had the transfer of the National Bison Range back to tribal management. So what was created by Teddy Roosevelt in 1908, a big chunk hole in the middle, 17,000 acres in the middle of the reservation was pulled out and turned into the National Bison Range. It has now been turned back over to the tribe with no money, mind you, but it's turned back over to the tribe. And one of the things we're working with them is understanding carbon cycling, for instance, of bison grazing on natural grasslands there, and carbon sequestration. So there's some really fun and exciting projects that'll be going on here. You can reach me through, and I do wear multiple hats. I have been at UNR for many years. I am transitioning full-time up to DRI at the end of this fiscal year. So I'm using my DRI as a contact. But if you ever have questions and you know, feel free to reach out to Stacy. She's our network. She's a co-PD on both the Native Waters and also on the new Native Climate Project. So feel free to look through our resources. If you go to that Native Waters on Arid Lands site, we have been collecting a wealth of resources and story maps that tell a lot about what's going on in Indian countries. So, and feel free to reach out to me, send me an email, or catch me during the course of the conference. And I look forward to working with you for the next 5 years on this new grant. Okay, questions? try and stand put still. I don't stand still very well. So I think one of the things, if I can, pulling a thread on John's project, one of the things we've worked really hard at was trying to engage both students and faculty at the 1994s in Native Waters on Arid Lands. And it is very different than working in the world of 1862s. The capacity issues that John identified, and the tribal colleges are very different. So I work very closely with Salish Kootenai College, which has not only many four-year degree programs, but they now have a new master's program in natural resource management. Their faculty has a little bit more bandwidth for research than some of the others. But they also struggle with just being able to get resources and institutional support for the concept of doing research. So if you have an opportunity to work with your 94s, please do. It's really important. We don't have one in Nevada yet, but watch Stacy. If anybody can make it happen, she can. But you do have tribal extension, and it's an invaluable resource. So. No questions?
Any other questions? All right,
Great.
thank you, Maureen. Thank you very much. And while we're waiting for our next speaker, I will do a quick little commercial break. The Western Governors Association, I think many of you saw they are for the very first time having an inaugural Young Leaders Academy. And Brett and myself worked with them on a conference grant and now have an opportunity for the Western Governors Leadership Institute for young tribal leaders. And that has been advertised. It's still open if you have any young tribal leader nominations. It is open until March the 25th at midnight. And if you would like further information, just let me know. I'll send you the nomination packet. I worked with John Phillips, and we've been working together as a team, and it's been just wonderful to be able to offer 5 openings for young tribal leaders to attend this WGA Leadership Inaugural Program. So through a NIFA conference grant. Thank you.
All right. Any other commercials? Shameless plugs, anything else?
So Barbara, there's a change in the program.
Oh, well, thank you.
We are going to move into a plenary session that involves the 3 individuals that have been highlighted so far today. And the very first question that they are going to talk about is, how can the directors in this room more effectively work with them, their organizations, to move the needle? And so I'll just come over with the mic for now. Okay.
Yeah. I thought I was coming this morning to listen to John and Maureen. So, but I think one of the questions as we take this time to do this pivot is really important. And how can we all work together to build these collaborations and these partnerships? Because each area of the country, just like each of our reservations, is different. Some of our 1862s are different. Our 1994s are different. So how can we build those partnerships and inroads? It's not easy because we have to build those relationships. But I think to start that discussion, as you are out there in your positions, sitting there and the wheels are turning, what first comes to mind on how you can build these collaborations across state lines, across sovereignty lines? You know, we heard this morning how states are sovereign. So we do have those sovereign states. We have the tribes that are sovereign. And then we have all of our early settlers out there. You know, I was just in the water network, and, you know, New Mexico is talking, and New Mexico, I love all of their Spanish land grants, but that's a deep history. That's just a deep history, just like our tribal governments.
So as we're here taking this time, are there some things that we can discuss that can move collaboration further?
Thank you, Stacy. It turns out that that was the perfect answer, time-wise and relevant. Our online speaker has joined us, so you are now off the hook.
I love the fact that we can be flexible. Good job. You stepped up to the plate. Our next speaker is Steve Gavazi, and he will be speaking on cultivating food security and food sovereignty in Native American peoples through the 1994 to 1862 Land Grant Partnership. Steve is a professor at The Ohio State University Department of Human Development and Family Science Program. He is currently the director of CHRR at The Ohio State University, which is an interdisciplinary research center that assists research worldwide to design surveys, collect, and manage data. Please join me in welcoming Steve.
Okay, good morning. Good morning to you all. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm having some difficulties with my internet, so I'm on my phone right now, so I apologize for that. Thank you for having me and giving me this opportunity to talking about some of the really important work I think that's going on right now in terms of cultivating food security and food sovereignty for Native American peoples. And this talk is almost exclusively going to be about at least the build up to and the imminent forecast of things to come with regards to 1994-1862 land grant partnerships. Next slide, please. So here's the spoiler alert. In case I get cut off, this is everything that I wanted to tell you about in the next 29 minutes. First, I would like to talk a little bit about the work that I've done prior to this most recent work with tribal nations and tribal colleges, which was to do a rather deep dive into the future of land grant universities. And I would like to talk to you about what it means to be land grant fierce, and then flip that to the other side of things and talk more about the land grab truth of the founding of the 1862 land grant universities. So from the most recent work that I've done in collaboration with First Nations Development Institute as our community partners, we've been able to begin, and it's really a begin, to hear and understand the voices of leaders, both of the 1994 tribal colleges, as well as some of the tribal nations who have been impacted by the land grab that led to the establishment of Ohio State University. The third piece then is to begin to center our discussion on more food-related issues within a larger set of concerns that Indigenous peoples have. And then finally, as it says here, I'm going to shamelessly promote the pre-conference that we're going to be hosting in October that will focus on the 1994 and 1862 partnerships. So next slide, please. So how this all started was a book that I co-authored with West Virginia University President Gordon Gee called Land Grant Universities for the Future. And this came out in 2018. It was based on a series of interviews that I had done with the leaders of the 1862 land grants. There were a total of 19 who participated. I'm sorry, there was a total of 29 who had participated, 27 from the 1862s. And it was a book that was really very forward-looking. We did a SWOT analysis, so we were paying attention to strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that land grants were facing presently, and we had asked the chancellors and presidents to look out 50 years onto the horizon. And those interviews, as well as interviews with 35 other what we called thought leaders from higher education, and that was a combination of faculty who study higher education. There were many people who were lawmakers, so legislators, governors. We had people from various different accreditation bodies who all participated in talking about this particular issue of land-grant universities. So next slide, please. This led to a second book that I was invited to co-edit with a colleague here at Ohio State, David Staley, who is in the history department and calls himself a futurist, in which we use the Ohio State University as a benchmark for looking forward to some of the issues that originally had come up in the 2018 book. This particular book was published in 2020, and it was actually to coincide with the sesquicentennial celebration that we were doing, our 150th birthday of the Ohio State University. Next slide, please. So in general, both of these books were very, very pro-land grant. And we coined the term being land grant fierce to begin to really help land grant universities appreciate all that they really had going for them. One of the things that we really felt as a function of the interviews that we had done with the presidents and chancellors was there seemed to have been a lot of mission drift. The drifting away from the tripartite mission of the land grant university, and in fact an imbalancing that really was occurring. The imbalancing in terms of the teaching, research, and community engagement mission seemed to more and more be heavily weighted towards research. And there are all kinds of difficulties inherent to that. That's not the topic of my talk today, but the idea of having all three parts of the land grant mission be equally valuable is a part and parcel of what we really meant when we said that people could experience a sense of being land grant fierce about that particular mission. So next slide, please. At the very moment, literally the same week that I had handed in the manuscript for that second book, Fulfilling the 21st Century Land Grant Mission, the Land Grab Universities report was published by High Country News. So most of the remainder of my talk is going to be flavored with the report and the ramifications of this report. In general, what had happened was High Country News, through some very, very sharp investigative reporting and some really amazing geomapping, had made the connections between the foundational land that was given to states in order to found each state's land grant university, traced back to the original tribes, the original tribal nations whose land was taken and sold in order to create these opportunities for land grant universities. Next slide, please. This was particularly interesting to people at The Ohio State University. We found actually that there were a total, as you can see from this map, there were tribes from as close as Michigan and as far away as California whose land was taken and sold in order to create The Ohio State University. A total of 110 tribes. And they gave a total of 636,000 acres that were given to Ohio State University. Next slide, please. One big difference you'll see here is the closer that you get to the Mississippi River and further west, this is the case of Wisconsin, states close to the Mississippi River and to the west, for the most part, had land given to them within their state boundaries. And so a very big difference that you will notice if you read the Land Grab Universities report is that those universities from states east of the Mississippi tended to have land scrip, which meant that they were getting land further west. And of course, as states were developed and as the United States continued to expand its territorial reach, there was less and less land that was actually available through the federal government to give to states. And so now what had happened, and Wisconsin was an early example of this, moving from east to west, of where all of the land was given inside of the state boundaries. And this comes as a shock to many people because when they hear about land and land acknowledgements or land grants, they think that the land that they were given was the land that the university's campus sits on. But in fact, what the High Country News report allowed us to see is that these were lands that were given to folks, even within a state, that were scattered way beyond the location of the campus itself. Next slide, please. So the question that I have for you, and this is what we will take up in the question and answer period, and I hope to save some time to answer some of your questions or listen to some of the issues that you think this raises. How is it that we can do both? How is it that we can be both land grant fierce and acknowledge the land grab truth of our foundation? I think it's critical for us to be able to do both, but in order to be able to do both, we have to be able to act on both of these somewhat disparate thoughts. Next slide, please. Uh-oh, looks like you got a shorter version of my slides, that's not good. There we go. All right. Oh, that made me immediately sweat. So I'm glad that you were able to pull that one back up. Okay, well, I'll just wait for you to get back to there. But what that next slide is going to show you, that one right there, is the first writing effort that I had done about the connection between land grant universities and the tribal the territories that were taken, was this Native American and Indigenous Studies Journal article that I did called Reckoning with the Original Sin of Land Grant Universities. And this was to simply acknowledge the fact that this was going to become an important part of the work that I saw our needing to do at The Ohio State University. But it was also in many ways an entreaty for folks to be able to begin to think about what they may need to do inside of their own land grant universities to both acknowledge what had happened and also, wherever possible, to act on that information in ways that hopefully were proactive and reparative in many ways. So next slide, please. Here at Ohio State, we actually had our brand new president at the time, Christina Johnson, set aside $1 million in order to combat racial injustice. And this largely had come out of course, all of the things that were going on, all the demands for social justice that were occurring, coincidentally with the Black Lives Matters movement and many other calls for social justice. We were one of 83 grant applications that went in. We were the only one that was focused on Native American issues. And out of that came what we ended up calling the Stepping Out and Stepping Up project. And that was short for the idea of stepping out of our comfort zones to deal with this kind of information and stepping up to our responsibilities to those tribal nations whose land had been taken and sold in order to found Ohio State. Next slide, please. So we actually had 4 different projects that came out of this work. The one that I'm going to be talking about most specifically was related to President Johnson's initiative, but we actually, through these 3 other projects, accumulated just shy of $250,000 to begin these efforts. However, what we now know is that we've probably reached the end of the immediate internal funds that we have available to us at Ohio State, and so most of our work now from this point forward is really going to be externally funded. Next slide, please. We have a mix of native and non-native scholars who are involved in this. It's highly recommended that when you do this kind of work that you have the appropriate mix of native and non-native scholars who will be doing this kind of work. And we also were very blessed to have been able to have our Indigenous partners at First Nations Development Institute, which is a Colorado-based economic development institute. In fact, it's the largest Indigenous-run Native American economic development institute in the country. Next slide, please. We have a website. It's very active for folks who are interested. It's called Land Grant Truth, and you can see the address there. And anyone who is interested in this can just Google Land Grant Truth, and this will immediately come up. We've been really good at documenting all of the different kinds of things that have come out as a result of both our project, but also other projects that we've learned about that other land grant universities are doing across the country. Next slide, please. So the big project was the one that I had been mentioning with regards to our connection to First Nations Development Institute. We were very fortunate to have the president's eyes and ears on this at all time, Mike Roberts, but also Rick Williams, who serves as an Indigenous consultant to First Nations, former head of the American Indian College Fund, has done extensive work. It just really helped out to have the kinds of social capital that Rick Williams brought to this particular project. What our initial focus was on was being able to give a voice to the voiceless, to be able to begin to make connections with those tribal nations whose land had been taken and sold in order to found Ohio State. And as it turns out, because of the difficulties that we had in the middle of a pandemic, making these kinds of connections as quickly as we would like, we also reached out quickly to tribal colleges, because many of those tribal colleges were actually serving the tribal nation communities that we were seeking to actually connect to. Next slide, please. So to date, we have been able to contact 12 leaders of tribal nations and 12 leaders of tribal colleges. And we are really hopeful that our work will continue and that we will be able to build on that. As it turns out, the original 110 tribes and bands whose land was taken in order to found Ohio State, in it, there are only 76 that are still in existence. And so that huge number that has been lost to history is part of what we're hoping to track. But we also, obviously, at 12 out of 76 active tribes, we have a long way to go before we can say that we have some representative voice. But at the same time, we still have an inkling of at least what some of these tribal leaders actually think. And again, it would be great if we could get to all 36 of the 1994 tribal colleges as well. We're a third of the way there. But again, we have some clues about what some sort of representative sample might be thinking. Next slide, please. The first set of interviews that we dealt with, because of the nature of the Tribal College Journal, was to talk about our interviews with the leaders of the tribal colleges. And that was an article that just came out in the spring issue of, I'm sorry, the winter issue of the latest Tribal College Journal. And actually, I have citations for that and links to that for anyone who's interested. Next slide, please. In general, what the tribal leaders told us was that the low-hanging fruit for them in terms of possible connections with the 1862 land-grant universities were going to be on those areas and those topics of interest that were of immediate impact, had some immediate impact on the communities that were served by these tribal colleges. So there was great interest in the further development of these partnerships. There were certainly some examples of ongoing partnerships that these tribal leaders, the tribal colleges reported to us, but there's much more work that needs to be done. And the other thing that they emphasized over and over again was the need to have some reciprocal relationship that's mutually beneficial for both the 1862 and the 1994. There tended to be some issues around an imbalance in terms of who was getting more out of that particular partnership. And again, because the 1862s are so well resourced in comparison to the 1994s, that this was something that we really wanted to pay a lot of attention to. Next slide, please. So yeah, there's the bottom line. These relationships were very spotty. There were some teaching and learning partnerships that we were able to identify, more in the way of research and community engagement partnerships. But all of the leaders that we talked to said that much more could be done. Next slide, please. So in order to answer the other part of the question, though, which is what is it that these tribes themselves need, we then wrote this second article. This is the one that will be coming out in the summer issue of the Tribal College Journal, so in a couple of months, which reports on these interviews that we had done. Next slide, please. In general, the topic areas that the tribal leaders themselves were focused on were far and varied. You notice that I've bolded out in yellow the food insecurity issue, as well as other basic needs. There are a lot of water crises that are going on. This group that I'm talking to, obviously you all are very familiar with that. Inadequate housing, unemployment concerns, inaccessibility of sacred places, on and on. Lots of different issues that the tribal leaders themselves believe are of critical importance for 1862 institutions to know about in order to begin to develop these relationships, these partnerships that would be mutually beneficial. Next slide, please. So how is it that we can facilitate these partnerships? Well, the first thing that we need to understand is that we really have a difficulty in terms of how we can get 1862 institutions to act quickly, right? So we really need to always be thinking about what is the low-hanging fruit. How is it that we can figure out things that the 1862 institutions and people inside of 1862 institutions can be paying attention to that are easy to start, easy to adopt, easy to get going, because we have so much ground to make up. Next slide, please. So for us at Ohio State, and in the contact that we had with the leaders of the tribal colleges, we decided that there was some interest in bringing together people to talk about this issue and to focus on the 1994-1862 partnerships. And so what I had done was I reached out to groups all across the country to put in a conference grant for NIFA at USDA to be able to begin to have this kind of dialogue, or it's not really begin, it's to advance the dialogues that have already been going on to date, but perhaps not as focused as we would have liked them to be. Next slide, please. So you can see all of the partners that I had approached. That includes people who are in the audience. Thank you very much. Your counterparts in the North Central region also were part of what NIFA calls collaborating investigators, as well as the leaders of the 3 tribal colleges that you see listed on this slide, and of course, AHEC and Falcon, who will be helping to lead the effort along with APLU and First Nations Development Institute. Next slide, please. So we got the grant. There's the shameless promotion now. Please mark on your calendars, October 19th of this year. This is the one day in advance of the regular Falcon conference. And so we have a full day planned. We are still solidifying speakers and both small and large group presenters who are going to be a part of that, but we're definitely in the middle of activity planning right now for both the conference and the pre-conference. Next slide, please. Our main task, of course, is to bring people together, especially those who are already doing these kinds of partnerships. And again, there's a strong but not exclusive focus on food sovereignty and food security issues. Next slide, please. We have 4 conference objectives. First, we think it's very important for the audience and participants to be able to define the terms that we want to use when we're focusing on food issues. Second, we want to be able to bring people together to hear about the current efforts that are already underway that involve both native and non-native stakeholders. Then more specifically, those particular partnerships that are occurring between 1994 and 1862 land-grant universities. And finally, the last objective, which is one that will go forward from this conference, which is that we really want to approach NIFA to be able to create a clearinghouse or some sort of support center that will gather up all of the information about partnerships, also some of the information that's out there on best practices, that Katie Hartman and others have been gathering with regards to specifically extension work, and be able to have, as I said, a one-stop shop where people can go who are interested in this and begin to really populate this with the information that everyone needs when they're actually focusing on the building of these kinds of partnerships. Next slide, please. I also was blessed to have a faculty fellows grant given to me by NCR-CRD. And so we will have a special focus as a build-up to this pre-conference with the North Central region. It is not at all to exclude any other region. In fact, I see the Western region as vital partners in this. However, because we have this extra funding from NCR-CRD, we are going to be pressing very heavily on the 20 tribal colleges and the 12 1862 land grants in the North Central region to be active participants in this pre-conference. Next slide, please. I've already said that, so we can go to the next slide, please. And again, now what we get back to, and I've hit the mark perfectly in terms of leaving at least 5 minutes, which is to talk about this idea of bringing back together this idea of being land grant fierce, being very proud of our tripartite mission, and at the same time, paying attention to the land grant truth of our founding. And I think that's it. And if it's not, I should just stop there anyway so that I can take some questions.
Thank you, Steve. We'll go ahead and open it up for questions, if any of you all have questions. Evidently, you did such a great job, Steve. I don't see anyone having any questions. Was there anything else you wanted to? Oh, we do have a question now. Yes, somebody raised their hand.
Hi, my name is David Gang. I'm from Washington State University. One of the questions I've got from the interviews you had with with all of the individuals you spoke with, and I was trying to get this out of what you were saying, and maybe I missed it. I don't know, but what are they proposing should actually be done? What kind of actual actions or activities? What's going to happen as a result besides just talking to them?
So when you say, are you talking about tribal colleges or the tribal nations?
Both.
Okay, so I meant to note that there is some difference there. So the tribal colleges do have some basic understanding of what it will take to bring these partnerships together, and they have different needs. So Tribal College A may really want to have partnerships around some of the academic programs that they're developing. I have an example of a group, a tribal college that I'm wanting to work with that has some interest in developing their early child education program, as an example. And so we would like to bring resources to them as they build out both their associate degree and potentially eventually a bachelor's degree in that area. For other people, it's going to be, and I think that tribal colleges are more used to land grants, 1862s coming to them and asking them to participate in research projects, either because there's a population that they want to study that's indigenous, or there are grant mechanisms in which there's a call very specifically for an 1862-1994 land grant partnership. And then finally, again, extension, I think especially, has a lot more past experience in creating programs for instance, 4-H in Indian country, which is something that I recently heard about coming out of the University of Idaho, which again, has a set of natural partners in there. The tribal nations themselves, by contrast, are really still only now getting up to speed with the idea that these 1862s played some role in the loss of their land. And so one of the things that we discovered in our small sample of 12 tribes was that none of them realized, I mean, everyone obviously understood that their land had been taken by the federal government. But what they did not understand was that that land subsequently was transferred to states in order to build these land grants. So these tribal leaders are still wrapping their heads around that idea. And so for them, it's much more basic in terms of what they're wanting. Right now, they're wanting some acknowledgement of that, but they also don't want to have a hollow land acknowledgement that just simply says, hey, thanks for the land. They want to know what land grant universities are going to do about that. And I also want to point out, there's something very different about your land grant university at Washington State. In fact, Washington State is the largest owner of land that's still on your books, in which I think Washington State is making $4 million a year off of surface and mineral rights from this tribal land that you still have ownership of. And in fact, there's 15 other land grant universities that still own tribal land. Ohio State, all of the land that they had, they sold off by the middle of the 1940s. But for 16 universities, yours included, there's still land on your books. And by the way, the other thing that I also want to point out too, is that every land grant university, all 52 that received land through the Morrill Act, have the money on your books right now. There is, in fact, an account. It's probably your earliest account that has the money that was originally given by the feds, because by federal statute, you had to have your principal held in perpetuity. What was supposed to happen was you were supposed to use the interest earned off of that principal in order to continue to build the university. And I probably said way much more than you wanted, but I got triggered there, and I thought I would just add all of that extra information.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. And I appreciate the shout out for University of Idaho, our 4-H director, Dr. Jim Lindstrom. This has been a passion of his to work with our Native people. And so really appreciate and the tribe. So I really appreciate that. I think this comes to the conclusion of our time together. And so now this group, we will be breaking for lunch. And so the lunch is in the Nampa, the Bistro Nampa room. And then we come back here, right back into this room at 1:30 for our meeting and provide updates with our national partners. So really appreciate you all being here, and we'll see you back here at 1:30.